Welcome to Powering the Future Within, the podcast where we explore the breakthroughs shaping the future of medtech. I'm Omari Bachnight, CEO of Resident Link Medical. Each episode, we speak with a leader who is driving the next wave of medical innovation, advancing technologies that are smarter, less invasive, and more connected than ever before. This is where the future of health takes shape. Let's dive in. Today's guest is Dr. Campbell Murray, co-founder and managing partner of Double Point Ventures. Campbell's work sits right at the intersection of clinical insight, company creation, and venture strategy. It's a combination that gives him a uniquely sharp lens on what it really takes to translate innovation into impact. Campbell, welcome to Powering the Future Within.
Thanks so much, Omari. I'm delighted to be here.
It's great to have you on. So to start with, what drew you to the field of biotechnology? You clearly have a very interesting background, very rare and interesting background, having studied as a physician.
Yes, so as you said, I studied as a physician in New Zealand, and in my last couple of years at medical school, so we had a 6-year program. I was really enjoying my time in the hospital with patients, but I started to feel that there was more to my journey personally, but also to the healthcare challenges we face. When you look in clinical practice and what physicians tackle, I mean, there's so much to admire and hold in awe, to be frank. But where in clinical practice, especially in a hospital setting, you're dealing with patients at the end or very late stage in terms of their journey by the time they're presented to a hospital. And for me, that wasn't satisfying. There certainly are ways in clinical practice where you can go upstream. But as I started looking at it, I decided that I felt I could have more impact and make a better contribution by going into the root source of solution for disease. And of course, that takes you to biotechnology, where you get this intersection of both the science, medicine, and entrepreneurship. And I've loved it ever since.
Do you find that as a clinician with a clinical background that you look at biotechnology perhaps differently than if you had pursued, let's say, a PhD in microbiology?
Yes, I do actually. The first thing I'd say is through the majority of my career in venture capital, I've been in larger teams with predominantly PhDs, where I've been one of just one or two other physicians in the larger venture capital team. And I actually think that's a really great skill set or complementarity set to bring to a VC team. At Double Point, we're actually both clinicians. One of my co-founder colleague is actually a practicing physician. And I'm finding that really helpful as I've been in VC now for 2 decades. It's actually, and I try to stay closely in touch. I'm still a member of the AMA and reading medical journals every week. But even now, having been out of clinical practice for 2 decades, it's actually really helpful within the team to have an actively practicing a physician with a very large patient roster. I would say to sort of crystallize it, uh, clinicians, when we're looking, or people who have been clinicians in venture capital, when we're looking at a startup or an investment opportunity, like everyone, you're looking first at the problem that's being addressed, and then you're thinking about how this will actually change patient outcomes. You're thinking about, will physicians and patients adopt it? Will the benefit be meaningful enough, or impactful enough for patients to take the risk with a novel technology? And I'd say PhDs come at it with a different uh, prism or viewpoint, which again can be very helpful to combine in the total assessment of the opportunity.
Right. Maybe more clinicians more on the application and PhDs traditionally more on the science.
Yeah, I would say that clinicians are professional skeptics. Throughout your training, you're taught to constantly question, and especially with the push towards evidence-based medicine, clinicians tend to wait till relatively late. We've all seen promising therapies that look amazing in mice and less amazing in humans. So I think we should all be doing it, but clinicians especially, okay, this works preclinically, but what does it actually mean for patients sitting in the clinic and how will it translate? Um, so yeah, I'd say I definitely bring that as part of my prism, or part of the lens through which I view new investment opportunities.
Right. And so you've been bringing this insight and perspective now, as you mentioned, over the past 2 decades, and you've had great success in venture investing, first as part of the Novartis Venture Fund, and then more recently as co founder of Double Point Ventures. Over the last 2 decades, how has venture investing changed in your perspective?
Changed dramatically. So maybe if I start at the micro level, I'd say biology has become programmable. So we're seeing advances in genomics, gene editing, computational biology, and now with the advent of AI, I think we actually have the ability now to design therapies in a very rational, programmable sense, almost like it's an engineering problem or a computational problem, than less than an organic biology problem. Of course, it is organic biology, but they're now intersecting. And that was very clearly on the horizon. I mean, we're both the same age. We went through the same grad school program together, Omari. And I even remember talking about it with you around 2002 and 2003, going into four. But it's gone from being science fiction to being reality. And I think we're even starting with the capabilities starting to surpass even the wildest dreams of science fiction. Um, was it Arthur C. Clarke who talked about, at some point science becomes indistinguishable from magic, and it's just incredible now the capabilities. Secondly, in terms of another change, when we both started together at the same time in entrepreneurship, I think the pools of capital felt huge to me, at least. I remember at the time, but now when we look back and we look at the relative size of and the abundance of capital in life sciences relative to where it was 2 decades ago, I mean, it's just a complete paradigm shift. And we can talk about why that is. And right at this very moment in time, it actually doesn't feel like it because AI is a giant vortex that's sucking so much of venture capital into AI. But it's still relative to where things stood in 2004/5 and funding levels then, I think, were at least one, maybe two log scales greater in terms of capital abundance. And
Right.
then third, I would say the industry's become even more global, more collaborative. It was very much a European and US endeavor 2 decades ago, and now it's truly a global endeavor. You may see academic discoveries coming out of Boston or the Bay Area or Melbourne or Basel. Um, and even more so now, it's all of those cities, but it's Shanghai, it's Delhi, it's Beijing, it's Tokyo, it's Seoul. So it's, very much global in terms of scientific impact, but it goes right throughout. Clinical trials now may be conducted just, in the US or Europe, but they may equally be conducted in Australia, in China, Eastern Europe. We're seeing manufacturing not just in the US and Europe, but a lot of it is in Asia. In fact, Asia dominates in terms of API manufacturing. And then even now, over the last couple of years, there's been a major development with exits where I think 50% of the big pharma licensing deals last year were struck with Chinese companies. Uh, 50%. Now, what's interesting actually is 0% of the acquisitions happened with Chinese companies. And I think that's probably by design. I don't know if it's bottoms up or if it's a top-down directive from the Chinese government, but we're not seeing Western farmers acquiring Chinese biopharmas or biotechs or medical device companies for that matter. But what Chinese regulators and at least the entrepreneurial community in China are very happy to do is partner their programs with Western or global big pharma and to a lesser extent medtech. So those are the three major changes, I'd say. Biology becoming programmable, capital flooding into the sector, and the industry is truly global now.
Yeah, those are definitely major differences. And maybe slicing it a little bit more cleanly, even, we still see a major difference between biotech and medtech in terms of access to the public markets and ability to raise capital. Why do you think that is the case and that difference exists?
So I definitely want to get your thoughts on this because you're much more of a medtech expert than I am. But I think it's driven. So here's my hypothesis. I think it's driven by the exits and the nature of the exits and when they occur. Um, First of all, you have a number of global big farmers, but also second and third tier big farmers who are potential acquirers and who often make acquisitions. When you look at the data, each of the big farmers makes 2 to 3 acquisitions a year on average. And obviously, there may be a year when a particular big pharma makes only one or even no big acquisitions, and there may be a year when a large pharma makes 4 acquisitions. But basically, the pipeline and the average over decades is 2 to 3 acquisitions per year of significance. And then you'll also see second and third tier pharma players making often multi-$100 million and occasionally billion-dollar upfront acquisitions. So you have a very robust M&A environment. And when those M&As are occurring, or when those acquisitions are occurring, is important too. About a third of them happen early phase 1 to preclinical. About a third happen between phase 1 and phase 2B. And about a third happen in phase 3 and early commercialization. So you have a constant flow that is providing liquidity to the entrepreneurs and to their investors. And by the way, what's really interesting is it is relatively robust through economic cycles. So you see that flow happening whether or not the IPO window's open. You see that flow happening whether or not we're in a buoyant economic macroeconomic environment, or whether we're in even in a recession. You still see big pharma making acquisitions. They may be looking for better deals. They may drive harder bargains when the broader economy has cooled, but they're still going to be replenishing their pipeline.
Right. Yeah, and
There
it
may
seems like
be
the focus on pipeline is so strong on the pharma bio side.
Right, the loss of exclusivity with products going generic, and you always see that analysis. And at the moment, the genericization or loss of exclusivity challenge or cliff that big pharma is facing over the next 5 years is gigantic. But honestly, every year, no matter when you do the analysis, because of the nature of patents, it's always going to be the case. I think the issue we face in medical devices is that there are less well-capitalized acquirers. So you see less opportunity to get an early exit. So right from the get-go, and I do want to get your thoughts on this, but as an investor at least, when you're reviewing a medical device or a medtech opportunity, you're having to assume that the default is that you'll be funding it through not just FDA approval, but also through the reimbursement process and early commercialization. And then it used to be the case that you could look for early market access in Europe, but that's actually becoming more challenging now in terms of the reimbursement landscape in Europe, even more fractured. So if anything, I think it's driving more of the medtech focus back on the US market. And then I think because there are fewer acquirers, they know it. They know they're in a strong position and they feel less for want of a better word for the term, FOMO. I mean, there's less fear driving the acquirers in medtech, less urgency. And so they'll wait for commercialization. Obviously, there are exceptions, and there are some really hot spaces where it makes sense to go early. Um, so, I think you just have this very much bifurcated dynamic between biopharma and medtech. Having said that, I think things are changing. So I really want to get your sense of things on as a medtech CEO. But I think we're seeing platform medtech companies now with more frequency. They're integrating a digital health component. They're not just claiming to be AI enabled. I think they're AI native medtech companies. I mean, we have a couple of those companies in our portfolio, and they're starting to look more like technology businesses. And we're even starting. When you're thinking about potential acquirers, you're not just talking about the Medtronics and Boston Scientifics and so forth. You're now starting to think, well, could Apple be an acquirer? Could Amazon be an acquirer? And so perhaps we're actually seeing an evolution where we're going to see a more aggressive and vibrant pathway to exits on the medtech side. But what are your thoughts as a CEO in this area?
Yeah, no, I completely agree that there is definitely a smaller number of potential acquirers or strategics traditionally in med tech. And so that enables the ability to wait longer until there's a perfect opportunity to acquire. And I think there's actually a self reinforcing mechanism that because they sometimes will wait longer to acquire, it puts a lot more pressure on the acquisition. And therefore, if the acquisition over the long term doesn't pan out, it becomes reinforcing of waiting longer and not acquiring earlier. So I think there's a much higher tolerance traditionally in biopharma for there to be a bet made, and perhaps that bet doesn't pay off. So perhaps you end up making multiple bets within a space or within a market, and there's tolerance of some level of failure, whereas that's not really as tolerated on the med tech side. So I think there's some reinforcing mechanisms, but I definitely think a dearth of strategics that are able to make acquisitions in the space is a primary driver. And that on the biopharma side, because you have a much more expansive universe of potential acquirers, it also unlocks the ability to go public a little bit more easily to gain some temporary so-called or bridge liquidity until there is an eventual exit because there's an inside knowledge amongst the investors that long term there will be a strategic partner that will potentially step up.
I think that's a great point. I didn't touch on the go public dynamic, and that's actually probably even more important or as important. Um, so when you look at the analysis of what drives venture capital returns, what's really driving the super performing top decile funds are the acquisitions, but because those drive your larger multiples. But you absolutely depend on the IPO market to cover the majority of your liquidity in your portfolio in terms of the number of companies. So if you say have a 10 company portfolio and just looking at the law of averages, and I'm not saying this applies to every venture fund, but there is a power law, obviously, with one or two of those companies you would hope would be the 10, 20, maybe even greater than 30x returns. But you may well have 6 to 7, maybe 8 companies that are not going to be early acquisition pathway companies. And those companies, you really need to have an IPO or a public market window that is receptive to providing liquidity for those companies. And you see that happening earlier with biopharma. So you
Yes.
can, with a very strong platform company, there have been plenty of instances over the last 2 decades where a third to half of the IPOs for biotechs have actually been preclinical companies. And then you'll see a third in early clinical and a third late clinical. You very rarely see clinical stage biotechs going public, basically because all the great companies have already gone public, at some point between preclinical and phase 3. In contrast, on the medtech side, there used to be a rule of thumb. I think it's getting weakened or diluted now, but it used to be a rule of thumb that you had to have at least 12-month trailing revenues of greater than 20 million with a rapid uptick. Um, and I know that's changing now, but that's another reason where I think, um, basically that has caused many venture funds to be cautious on the medtech side. So you really just have a few pioneers, or say stalwarts in the sector, who continue to invest early and throughout the life cycle. Um, for Double Point, as we're a first-time fund and we're diversified across therapeutics, medtech, diagnostics, and services, for all areas outside therapeutics, we tend to be a later stage investor for these reasons, for exactly what we've been discussing.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. And as alluded to earlier, it may be more robust, it may be less robust, but essentially the IPO opportunity for biopharma is essentially always open on the medtech side. It's typically come in waves. I think the last major medtech IPO window was back in 2020, and you could tell that essentially at that time everyone knew the window was opening. So you saw a lot of the assets, a lot of the companies that were going out initially in a very strong position, and towards the tail end, when people knew that the window was coming to a close, you saw some companies going out that you typically wouldn't see going out to take advantage of that window opportunity. And then over the past, few years, we've been really waiting for that window to open again. But I think we're seeing some alternative paths to sort of the traditional IPO for medtech starting to open up. Some companies going public, for example, on the Australian exchange, which I think some companies have done quite successfully. So I think people are starting to consider that, and potentially other options. And as you say, this sort of traditional perspective of having to have trailing 12 months revenue of 20 million with rapid uptake, 50 to 100% year on year growth trajectory, that's starting to lessen, and then some additional considerations. And even recently, a couple of companies filing in medtech without those types of metrics in exploring the IPO market. So it'll be interesting to see which direction this all goes in.
Yeah, I'd love to get your thoughts on when you think it will open again or reopen. We have at least two companies who would very much like it to be in the next couple of years at least.
Yeah, well, we're starting to see some warming now. We're seeing a couple of med tech companies considering to go early, and I think over the next couple of months, we're sitting here recording this essentially at the beginning of April. But I think we'll see over the next couple of months how successful those are, and I think a lot of people are taking tabs on that, and that might determine whether we see a broadening opening. So to
Fingers
that
crossed.
point, I'm curious, as you look, you've been part of multiple IPOs. Are there certain elements that for you suggest when the right time is to go, whether it's biopharma or medtech?
Maybe starting with biopharma, and then maybe we can make it a team effort on medtech.
Fair
So
enough.
on the biopharma side, I think it's three main criteria. You have to have credible data. You have to have a clear development path. Even for a preclinical company, I think a clear development path through major clinical milestones or inflection points. And then including the capital being raised in the IPO, but often with a crossover round, you need to have enough capital to more than reach the next major milestone. And, truly a major one, not a minor event. And I think investors really want to see at least 12 months runway beyond that major milestone. So on the biopharma side, I think, it's pretty simple. You can start to add flourishes about single asset companies, perhaps needing to develop a pipeline or a story so it doesn't become purely a binary bet, because often for an IPO, public investors are pretty cautious about truly binary bets, even though you could argue that they should be able to have a portfolio of opportunities and provide the diversification across their portfolio. But for IPOs, I think you typically want to have more than a single binary asset, although it depends. As assets become later stage, that becomes less important. Um, I guess the last aspect I would argue is sometimes, markets go through cycles, and and we can think through, you mentioned 2020 through 22. Clearly, investors were extremely enthusiastic about biotech, about life sciences. The windows were wide open. And then you go through other parts of the cycle and investors become much more cautious. I actually think through the end of last year, we were going through an uptick in terms of where we were in the cycle. And I think, when you spoke to most entrepreneurs, investors, the bankers, Wall Street, I think the general sense was this was going to be a bullish year for IPOs, and the window was going to be wide open. And that just goes to show you that it's not just about what's happening in the technology area or the sector. We're obviously
Right.
all part of the world, and macroeconomic forces play a major part. So I think at this immediate moment where we are in terms of the uh, geopolitical risks and global risks, I think the IPO window is going to be closed. But should peace break out, and I hope it will in the next days or weeks, I actually still think the conditions are there where we could see the IPO window be open. And I hope, and I'd love to get your thoughts on this, not just for biotech or life science therapeutic companies, but also medtech. Um, but maybe I build off your thoughts on the medtech side.
Yeah, I think on the med tech side, there's what's traditionally been looked at, and I think there's some trends that are moving in a favorable direction. But I think essentially, you want to be able to evaluate a company that has the ability to trend towards 80% gross margin profile has kind of been the historics. I think if you're sitting at a 60, 65% gross margin, but have the ability to produce a story that gets you to the 80%, that's always heavily looked at. I think one of the areas of skepticism that often comes up is whether or not you're seen as a single product company. And I think there's some allowance for being a single product company if you're in a large category with the ability to get to that margin profile with a straight line towards reimbursement, which is always a major consideration, and the ability to drive towards double digit growth. So I think that people really want to be able to see companies that can have trailing 12 months of revenue of $100 million after being in market for 4 to 5 years. They don't want to have to worry about capital considerations a year or 18 months after the IPO. So that's always a major consideration as well. And then I think the component that you started to hit on, which might be what tips the scale in medtech, is more of the consumerization of it. So medtech companies that perhaps are reimbursed by traditional venues, but also have the potential to be seen more in a type of through a consumer lens. Is that something that when you start to evaluate medtech companies, because DoublePoint is starting to dip its toe or take a move in that direction, is that something you consider, or are there certain other types of profiles of companies that are attractive to DoublePoint?
I do. There's one thing you raised actually, and is thinking about the different risk profiles on therapeutics and medtech. I'd love to come back to that, but just to answer your question, yes. So about 75% of our portfolio is, or we design or aim for it to be in therapeutics, and then 25% in everything else. And of that, the majority of that 25% is going to be in medtech. So I think our portfolio reflects our priorities in this area. So we're focused on advanced diagnostics where we think it will change clinical practice. So this goes back to your first point about, your background or our background, two physicians at DoublePoint. We're not just looking for beautiful, elegant science supporting diagnostics. We're actually looking at how will the diagnostic output change clinical practice at the bedside or for that patient's journey. We're also very interested in AI native enabled devices. So there we have a couple of examples that are notable. One company that's doing super well on the execution side is Echo Health AI driven stethoscopes. I think we're going to get to the point in the future where it will be a medico legal issue if the physician or the healthcare provider, the nurse or any other member of the healthcare team relied on clinical treatment based on an old fashioned stethoscope. I think we're going to get to the point where actually it's going to need to be a digital AI enabled stethoscope because frankly the technology has capabilities and a level of precision in diagnosis that's only matched by perhaps the leading clinicians in a given specialty, whether it's a cardiologist on the cardiac side or a pulmonologist on the pulmonary and so on. I don't think it'll be acceptable. Maybe it's 5 years, 10 years out, but at some point, I don't think it will be acceptable to rely on, on a non-digital, uh, interpretation, which is so subjective and variable and, prone to human error when someone's life is at stake. We're also all in on neurotechnology and minimally invasive platforms. So we have one of our newest portfolio company investments is in a brain-computer interface company, a BCI company called Synchron, which we're really excited about. So that's most of our investments in the space, such as EcoHealth, for example, have been revenue stage, where we're almost arguably more growth equity than early stage venture capital.
Right.
But on Synchron, we went earlier, years before it will be submitting to the FDA, and beginning its commercialization journey. And we did that because of the space and the intensity, but also because of the what we think of as the opportunity set. But just going back to your point as you were talking about the path to going public and reflecting on how late stage medtech companies, I mean, they were quite mature in their journey if they're $100 million a year revenue company. And I think it really speaks to the different risk lens that investors apply when they're looking at biotech opportunities and when they're looking at medtech. So on the biotech side, you're taking a lot of technology risk. Quite simply, the the uh, the the solution to the problem you're investing in biotech may simply not work from a technology perspective, especially if you're investing preclinically. But even when you're investing early in the clinic, there may be a larger clinical trial where you get, an adverse effect or some idiosyncratic reaction that's just part of biology that just couldn't have been predicted. So you're taking on significant technology risk. But generally, you're doing it in an area where there's a clearly understood problem with a high unmet need, and you know that there will be a large number of commercial acquirers who essentially will take care of the commercial risk for you. So you have to solve as an investor or entrepreneur in this area, you have to solve the technology problem. But essentially, the belief is if you build it, they will come. And then on the medtech side, it's the complete converse. Actually, very early on, you can build a prototype. It might be rudimentary. It might be 20 times the eventual size and product format that the end device will be 10 years in the future. But very early on from a technology perspective, I don't know, vagus nerve stimulation or, a brain computer interface, rudimentary device that you get working in animal models. If you can do it there, you can translate it into humans. And then very early on, often you can get an early read in humans before you run the larger trials, and it's likely to translate. But now, as an investor, or even more importantly, as an entrepreneur, or CEO of a company in the space, you have to tackle the reimbursement and commercial landscape, and
Yeah.
then you have to show traction. And the big med tech companies are not stepping in until the commercial aspect is largely de-risked. So it's a really interesting dynamic or a different set of challenges. Um, and that's why we're quite humble. Well, we're try to be humble in everything we do, but especially on the medtech side. Um, and we obviously enjoy working very much with entrepreneurs and also the investors in this community because but as someone in the space in a fund that's investing in both spaces, I love it
Yeah.
because it gives you the full spectrum of um, of tackling the healthcare system, right from the upstream root source of the disease or the pathology that you're trying to help address, through to actually the human dynamics of patient adoption, physician adoption, or physician integration into their practice, and then payer support and regulatory support. And so it really, really brings it all together when you get to do that.
Yeah, it's fascinating to think about the contrast that you just touched on. The fact that proof of concept on medtech could come quite early, but proof of adoption it comes very, very late. And on biopharma, proof of concept might take quite some time, but there's an assumption that if you get there, you'll be able to get to delivery. I think part of the difference, which is really interesting to explore, is that in biopharma, the mechanism of delivery to the patient is generally the same. Whereas with medtech, the delivery to the patient is always quite different. And so there's training often involved either with a physician or with a patient, and you have to disrupt sometimes what their clinical practice is or what their workflow is in the operating room or the procedure room. There's obviously always the reimbursement question that comes into play. So, proof of adoption, which is much more of a subjective exploration than an objective one, comes quite late with medtech. And I think that's the piece that sometimes makes strategics a little bit hesitant until they've seen proof of commercialization. That being said, I would suspect if you looked at the full economic chain in terms of early investments all the way through to when you see returns from adoption, I would argue that they're probably similar in terms of returns. The difference is when these strategics are willing to come in and take some of the risk burden along with the company. And obviously, on biopharma, there's a much higher tolerance to take the risk burden earlier on.
Yeah, and I don't think it's because I'll say we're angels on the biopharma side or we're devils on the medtech side. I think it's just because the medtech side can be patient because there isn't the same competitive intensity. If Boston Scientific saw multiple acquisitions in areas that it considered core because its competitors were taking out, you know, promising venture-backed startups earlier than it would have liked, I think within a year it would change its practice and it would start taking that commercialization risk. Just because there are fewer potential buyers, I think they don't have to. Conversely, if biopharmers could wait longer, I think they would. But there's too many, and the stakes are too high. So that drives them to go earlier. What is interesting, though, is now with increased innovation coming out of China, and just sort of echoing that statistic already from the earlier in the podcast, half of all licensing deals done globally last year were with Chinese startups from Western big farmers. In a sense, you can say that's disintermediating the VC community in the US and Europe or globally, and also traditional entrepreneurs who were developing many of these startups. So it will be, I guess we're going to see over the next few years how this situation evolves. I mean, obviously, many Western VCs now are actually sending teams to China and they're trying to identify the assets. I've had lunch in the last couple of months with a number of American entrepreneurs who are trying to find assets in China and license them before the big farmers do, and then bring them and start US clinical trials. So there definitely are changing dynamics on the biopharma side. I'm not as I do know there's medtech activity in China as well, but I'm not aware of the data in terms of what's happening on the commercial or BD side with the Chinese medtech startups. I mean, do you have any data or
Yeah,
knowledge?
there's definitely a lot of activity. I think the challenge has been the regulatory environment for the U.S. has always been a little bit more opaque, even for European companies, but in particular for Chinese-based companies. And so what we're seeing is the need or desire to develop U.S.-based footprint with U.S.-based personnel who've navigated the approval process. But even as we sit here in 2026, it's been very challenging and more, it's not very uncommon to have seen Chinese-based companies be able to navigate the FDA landscape. I think that we'll see that change, but it's something that we haven't seen as commonly yet. And I think that's the last major piece to really see come to fruition before we see a lot more Chinese-based med tech in the US.
Really interesting.
But I'm interested, you mentioned two really great examples in terms of Double Point making some investments and quite different examples. as well in some cases. So you were saying with the digitally based driven AI stethoscope, the ability to really enable is the thinking there that you'll be able to detect more murmurs, valvular conditions, and are you also very interested in the ability to democratize this ability out of the hands of few and get it into the hands of many? Is that the thinking there?
Yes, absolutely. First of all, it's bringing everyone up to the high standard that the best cardiologists or pulmonologists currently have. And that can be now in the hands of, uh, uh, you know, a nurse, a medical student, a junior medical resident, all the way to a seasoned, you know, specialist. It could be, you can now have a psychiatrist with the diagnostic capabilities of a Mayo Clinic cardiologist or pulmonologist, and so I think that's the first aspect, taking what the best humans can already do, and as you put it, democratize that across all of us. But then beyond that, um, the technology has the capability to diagnose things that humans can't through a stethoscope, that we need to either employ ultrasonography or echocardiography or other technologies to be able to do. The stethoscope now can detect pressure gradients across valves. And there's a level of sensitivity where it can hear, it can hear heart murmurs that may be inaudible even with a high-end stethoscope too. And I'm sure there'll be some people that have highly sensitive hearing, but as you know, as we all get older, just aging is what it is. We start to lose sensitivity to um, to certain levels of noise. So the digital stethoscope will never do that. It will also record what it's hearing, so you can play it on a speaker later. It will integrate billing. It will not only integrate the diagnosis, but it will integrate the billing. It will start to help the doctor manage or the nurse or the caregiver manage the patient's not just diagnostic and billing codes, but also the treatment pathway, and it will do so in a multi-team way, and it will all do this through both the device itself, but integrated with the software, which is all through the cloud. So, I mean, I think this is just a one specific example, but I think this is where healthcare across the US, Europe, Australasia, and advanced economies globally is going to take us. And
Right.
and looking at developing countries too, I think this technology will put into the hands of caregivers in countries that may be under-resourced. It's going to allow them to leapfrog a generation of training and capabilities. And you're going to, as long as they can have access to the internet, which obviously is is an important criteria. But in the age of you know satellite internet access, I think it's going to get more and more enabled. Um, People anywhere on the planet are going to have leading edge care capabilities that previously you wouldn't have gotten in a non-quaternary hospital in the US, and now
Right.
everyone's going to have it globally.
Yeah, it's amazing, and I can imagine as you aggregate more data that the sensitivity will only improve, the data, the ability to make assessments will only improve. So it becomes a very powerful data play as well.
Right, and it keeps learning.
Right.
The more data, it's just like Tesla or Waymo with driving. The more miles you get, the better the technology gets, and it's going to be exactly the same
Yeah.
with an AI stethoscope, but pretty much in any aspect of healthcare. Now, arguably, this is one area where China and perhaps some startups in India will have an advantage just through sheer force of numbers. But I think the US is more than in the cutting edge or the leading edge of many of these technologies. So I think it bodes really well. It's a great time to be alive. It's a great time to be investing. It's a great time to be an entrepreneur in this space.
Absolutely. And on a different edge of the spectrum, brain computer interface, you made a lot of news a few months ago, leading the Series D in Synchron. What made you so attracted to the company and what makes BCI so exciting?
It was an area that we actually researched 18 months ahead of, engaging actively with the Synchron team, who essentially I cold called, and I found a mutual contact who was able to make a warm introduction. But essentially, it was a directed strategic search where we concluded they were one of the three leading companies in the space, if not, in our opinion, the leading company, but taking a very different approach from all of the other brain-computer interface companies. So, BCI is essentially, I think, one of the most exciting frontiers in medicine. The idea that we might be able to restore communication or mobility to patients with paralysis is extraordinary. And then just thinking where we go beyond that, it's a classic disruptive innovation in that sense. And then what specifically attracted us as a firm to Synchron, there's a multidimensional from the technology aspect. We believe they're the leading minimally invasive approach. And I'll speak more to that in a moment. But just as critically from a team and personnel aspect, but particularly the founding team and the founders who are very mission driven, high integrity, very upfront when they run into challenges in terms which every startup, and especially in the highly innovative areas, must encounter as part of the journey to success. And so it was a team that we continue to have very high confidence and conviction in. And then, going back to their approach, which differs from most of the other companies in the field, which are, essentially putting burr holes in the skull. So they're performing craniotomies, and then they're relatively invasively inserting the device into the brain parenchyma or on the surface of the brain once they've made a burr hole in the skull. Synchron took a fundamentally different approach from the inception point, which was looking at essentially it's the device is called a stentrode, as in cardiac stent, combined with electrode. And just as you access the inner workings of the most sensitive areas of the heart through the vascular system, so it bypasses the need for open chest surgery. The fundamental insight that the Synchron team had is we can access the brain through the patient's vascular system. So they put, the physician will put a little tiny nick in the jugular vein, and then essentially snake the stentrode through the venous system, and then implant it in the two largest veins run down the center of the skull. They're called the superior sagittal sinus, one vein on each side running down the midline. And then you can place a very elegant stent that has a minimally invasive form factor directly into the patient's superior sagittal sinus vein. Within 2 to 3 months, the vein has re-endothelialized. So basically meaning the endothelial wall essentially engulfs the stent. And then, if you go back 2 or 3 months later with a camera, you might see a tiny little indentation in the vein's wall, but essentially it just looks like a natural vein. And through that stentrode, it's picking up electrical impulses from the patient's brain, and then it's interpreting that. It's feeding those impulses to a chip integrated with AI, and the capabilities as AI further the capabilities of the BCI will be further enhanced as AI is enhanced. And what's critical is the innovation can keep happening outside the patient once the device is implanted, because you can have innovation with NVIDIA and the chips that NVIDIA provides happening outside the patient, receiving those same electrical impulses, and then drawing more information and more capabilities coming out of that with the processing power of the external chips. So NVIDIA is highly interested in Synchron. I mean, as it is, to be fair, in all companies in the BCI space, but Synchron is definitely a company on NVIDIA's radar. Synchron is a company on Apple's radar. So what's incredible to me actually is right now in your iPhone, it's already got in all Apple devices a BCI interface capability that's already native to Apple's iOS. And so the Synchron device, which has already been implanted in 10 patients, um, is already integrated with Apple's Vision Pro. It's actually a great example of a use case with the Apple Vision Pro. So you can have a patient who has lost the use of their arms and legs, so they're quadriplegic, and through a combination of the Synchron device and Apple Vision Pro, can control everything in their home environment. They can turn on the radio, they can turn on the TV, they can type on their computer screen, they can play games. If they're in a intelligent home, they can turn on the air conditioning, they can change the temperature, they can turn the fan on, they can release dog pellets. There's a TV advertisement with this where they feed their dog, and so it's a even at this early stage of the technology's development, it's really transformational for patient's journey or patient's life and their well-being. And, I think the sky's the limit with this technology in terms of what will be possible in the future. You could imagine placing stentrodes over the motor cortex for the patient. So as the patient is naturally thinking about how they would have liked to move their hands or their legs or another part of their body, you could now have the device receiving those signals, processing that, and then in the future, you could have either an exoskeleton or perhaps an integrated output that actually then controls the patient's musculature. So obviously, that's science fiction. That's in the future, but I think we're at the first leg of the journey where you can see what's possible now. And it's a really it's a very competitive space. Elon Musk's Neuralink is extraordinarily well known, but there are a number of other leading US companies. There are a couple of European competitors that are quite formidable. And then I'd say, the BCI space is on the 5-year plan for the Chinese government. It's one of the prioritized technology areas over the next 5 years for China. And so there's incredible technology and competition emerging from China as well. So I think it all goes well for patients, and I think it's going to be a really exciting area to be a part of, a small contributor. I mean, obviously, it's all about the team, the people who are doing this at Synchron and at the other BCI companies.
Wow. I mean, goes back to your comment around science fiction and reality really, really starting to dovetail together. I'm curious, what will be some of the initial conditions that would be targeted for a technology like Synchron?
We're initially targeting patients with um, mid to late stage ALS are the primary patients we hope to serve. I think also it could be spinal cord injury patients. So we're very much focused on a severe, high unmet need medical patient population. Um, for whatever reason, have lost the use of their arms and their legs. But in terms of the standardized path in clinical trials, and we will be approaching pivotal clinical trials this year, we hope, it will be predominantly an ALS community population, just so we can, um, you don't want to change too many different things or have too many different variables in your late stage clinical trials as you're proving a new technology. And so in that sense, we want to standardize as much as possible our patient population to best help the patients and then best profile, a cutting edge technology.
Well, that's very, very exciting. So you have the opportunity to speak with a lot of technologists, a lot of founders, and you're seeing this world transform right in front of us. What is some advice that you would give to an innovator who's building and looking to drive funding and to get support from the venture capital community?
Sounds extraordinarily obvious, but I'll say it anyway. I think the most important thing from an innovator's perspective is make sure the problem you're seeking to solve is the most impactful problem that you would want to tackle. A lot of people put a lot of energy into addressing a problem which may already have partial or perhaps competitive solutions. And it's not to say that your solution won't be better or superior, but it does make your journey in raising capital a lot more difficult. So that would be the first thing, is make sure you pick a problem or select the problem that you wish to address, where you believe you have a path to a technology that will solve it, but most importantly, that problem will be understood by everyone else to be a critically important problem to solve. And that's from a venture capital perspective or an investor perspective. I mean, it all comes down to what's the problem and what's the solution. So I think the first thing is to make sure that a good problem is selected. Then I think you have to think through the scientific feasibility, the economic feasibility, policy alignment, especially on the medtech side. For all the reasons already discussed at the beginning of the conversation. And I think you have to, whatever you see at the beginning is going to be precisely wrong. It's definitely going to be different. I mean, 99.9% of the time, by the time you're through to a successful outcome. But I think it's still very helpful at that beginning to have crystallized, those aspects. You're thinking about the regulatory framework that you're going to be navigating the solution through. You're thinking about the reimbursement systems. You're thinking about the access that reimbursement enables. So I'd say that's all part of it. Entrepreneurs have to think through a lot of things. You have to chew gum and walk at the same time. You can't just focus on one niche aspect. That can be people within the team, but from a CEO or founder perspective, I think you have to have a global vision.
Makes a lot of sense. And speaking of global visions, okay, let's put one of the world's most debated topics to rest here and now. So, which country has the most credible claim to inventing pavlova? New Zealand or Australia?
Well, this is clearly a trap. As a New Zealander, I'm obligated to say that the evidence overwhelmingly supports New Zealand. So I'll give you some facts. It's always helpful to begin with the fact base. The dessert was named after the Russian ballerina Anna Pavlova during her tour of New Zealand in the 1920s, so just over 100 years ago. I guess if I wanted to be a diplomat, I think our Australian friends, well, they may dispute that. There's pretty strong historical documentation on this point. But in the spirit of international diplomacy, I'm happy to acknowledge that Australians have made excellent contributions to pavlova consumption.
Well done. Well done. Ever the diplomat, and very well done for an investor who's invested in some Australian companies as well.
Yes,
So
starting with Synchron. So
yes,
Synchron came
yes.
out of Melbourne University. And the
Exactly.
CEO and much of the core team, who are all outstanding, are Australians from Melbourne.
Absolutely. So the next time you all get together, you can enjoy some nice pavlova together and all be on the same page.
Yes, I won't be able to let them listen to this podcast interview now, so I'll have to keep this on the down low. But yeah.
All right, we'll limit the distribution to all countries other than Australia.
Thanks, Omari. It was a real pleasure to be on your show.
Well, the pleasure was mine. It was just tremendous having you on. Really enjoyed all of your perspectives and really can feel your excitement for the future for biopharma and for medtech. And thank you for joining us on Powering the Future Within. If this conversation inspired you, follow the show and share it with your medtech community. I'm Omari Bachnight. Stay inspired and keep innovating.